So let us take up a brief discussion on wetlands. And one of the major ecological challenges faced by wetlands, which is called as eutrophication. Now, wetlands, as you understand, these are the ecosystems which are having a characteristic of a water regime which is at the surface level, as well as there is going to be a low-lying relief. So because of the low-lying relief, the water tables are risen in a manner such that the soil over here becomes completely saturated with water. Along with that, these ecosystems will have natural vegetation which is adapted to these waterlogged soils. So the natural vegetation, whatever plants, they could be trees, they could be grasses, depending upon whether the natural vegetation is trees or grasses, we'll have different nomenclatures for that wetland. But whatever natural vegetation is there, the natural vegetation is completely adapted to be surviving in these waterlogged soil. So the defining characteristic of these ecosystems, of these wetlands, becomes that there is going to be hydrological regime in a manner that the water is at the surface level. The soils will have anaerobic conditions over here because the soils have become completely saturated with water, and the natural vegetation is adapted to be surviving in these waterlogged conditions. So the natural vegetation of wetlands which is adapted to these waterlogged conditions is also called as hydrophytes. Hydrophytic vegetation, hydrophytes, is what we call the natural vegetation of the wetlands as. Now wetlands, as you know, they have pretty much in news. More so Ramsar sites are in news. And Ramsar sites have been in news because lately there have been a lot of additions to India's list of the Ramsar sites. If I talk about year 2018, 2018 was the time when India had 27 Ramsar sites. And in the last 3 years or so, there have been too many of the new Ramsar sites, as many as 48 of the Ramsar sites which have been added to the list of Ramsar designations from India, such that the total tally of the Ramsar sites from our country right now is 47 Ramsar sites. Now 75 Ramsar sites. So these 75 Ramsar sites is what India has right now. Ramsar Convention, as you know, the convention goes back to 1971. So the convention goes back to 1971, and the basic objective of the Ramsar Convention is wise use of the wetlands. The basic objective of the Ramsar Convention is the wise use of the wetlands. Wise use of the wetlands. If I give you small pieces of information related to India's Ramsar sites, Tamil Nadu is the state right now which has the highest number of Ramsar sites. Sundarbans is the largest Ramsar site of our country, though there are certain examples of the states which don't have any Ramsar site. This is where the UPSC is going to probably, confuse you with the prelims questions, because most of you will be focused upon which state has the highest number of Ramsar site, which is the largest Ramsar site. But there are states in our country which don't have any Ramsar site as well. For example, Telangana does not have any Ramsar site. Jharkhand doesn't have a Ramsar site. For that matter, Telangana, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Arunachal, otherwise pretty much endowed with biodiversity of all types, but doesn't have a Ramsar site as of now. Sikkim also does not possess any Ramsar site as of today. So there are certain examples of the states in our country as well which do not have any Ramsar site. Of course, Tamil Nadu leads the tally over here with 70 out of the 75 Ramsar sites. Highest number of the Ramsar sites, 14, are found in the state of Tamil Nadu alone. So Ramsar Convention came up in the year 1971 when the parties to the convention, they decided to go for the wise use of the wetlands. Now wetlands, like many other ecosystems over the planet, are threatened ecosystems, and there are a number of threats being faced by wetlands. For example, diversion of the water of the wetlands for irrigation purposes could be one of the threats faced by the wetlands, which leads to the changes in the hydrological regime of the wetlands as well. I am meanwhile more interested in discussing how water pollution happens in wetlands through the process of eutrophication. This process of eutrophication is something which affects not just wetlands but other water-based ecosystems as well. Like oceans may be adversely affected, rivers may be adversely affected because of eutrophication. So the conventional challenges being faced by wetlands, encroachment over the wetlands or water diversion of the wetlands which disturbs the hydrological regime of the wetlands is something which you must have commonly read across, because when the Bengaluru flooding happened in our country, it was again in news that the natural drainage basins like wetlands etc. are being encroached upon in an illegal manner. Meanwhile, I said that let us discuss eutrophication because this is something which can have severe consequences for the health of the water-based ecosystems in general. So, eutrophication, understanding the process of eutrophication. If I break up this term eutrophication, Eu means good or rich and trophic refers to nutrient. So basically eutrophication in literal sense refers to well nourished. Eutrophication in literal sense means well nourished. Now let us understand how eutrophication takes place, how good nourishment of a hydrological ecosystem, water-based ecosystem can happen. The water-based ecosystems could be marine ecosystems which are related to oceans, could be freshwater ecosystems related to lakes, and the water-based ecosystems are also the wetlands. They are also the wetlands. Whatever primary production happens in any ecosystem, that goes true for the terrestrial ecosystem, also for the water-based ecosystem. The primary production will depend upon availability of nutrients, availability of minerals as well. In case any of the nutrients are in short supply, it may become a limiting nutrient. It may become a limiting nutrient. So I said a very simple thing. I said, in case any of the nutrient is in short supply, if any of the nutrient is in short supply, it may become a limiting nutrient for the primary productivity of that ecosystem. For the primary productivity of that ecosystem. A simple example to understand this. For example, the soil. If the soil does not have enough of nitrogen and now agriculture is being done over that soil, nitrogen may be called as a limiting nutrient because of the deficiency of nitrogen. The crop productivity will be limited over there, will be capped over there, will be suppressed over there, right? So that is what is meant by a limiting nutrient, that if any of the nutrient which is needed for the photosynthesis and the primary productivity is available in the short supply, we may call it as a limiting nutrient. For the water-based ecosystems, there are examples of limiting nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus. These two commonly are the limiting nutrients for water-based ecosystems. For example, for the oceans. For oceans generally, for the marine ecosystems generally it is nitrogen which is in short supply, and for the freshwater ecosystems it is phosphorus. But we can take a general rule over here that for aquatic ecosystems, two common limiting nutrients are nitrogen and phosphorus. Whenever these limiting nutrients now will be available to that ecosystem in abundant supply, there will be a sudden increase in the primary productivity. It is as good as over an agriculture field, I said, that let's say nitrogen is in deficiency and now the farmers start applying nitrogen based fertilizers which is going to increase the crop yield. So something similar like fertilization over an agriculture field which is done deliberately will happen if there are pollution sources for the aquatic ecosystems. Pollution sources. So let us understand how the pollution sources can be a means of cultural fertilization for these aquatic ecosystems. Now the pollution sources like agriculture runoff, like sewage disposal, also industrial effluents, sewage disposal, also industrial effluents, can be some important sources of the pollution which can start affecting these aquatic ecosystems. So now these are the major sources of pollution for the aquatic ecosystems, and all of these major sources of pollutants can be very, very rich in the limiting nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus. Like agriculture runoff will be specifically rich in NPK. The sewage is going to be laden with phosphorus depending upon the industrial activities being performed. Again, industrial effluents may have these limiting nutrients available. Which now means that there is a kind of human-caused fertilization of this water-based ecosystem which is going to take place. And this fertilization or this abundant supply or this enrichment of the nutrients, limiting nutrients into that aquatic ecosystem will be called as eutrophication. Like I said, U over here refers to good or rich. U over here refers to good or rich. And trophic refers to nutrients. So basically, whenever the nutrients are going to be made available in a good supply, we can call the process as eutrophication. There are some water bodies which can be naturally eutrophic. That is, they will have good supply. The general rule I said that nitrogen and phosphorus are the limiting nutrients. But of course, there can always be certain exceptions in the natural cases. So, there can be certain water bodies which are naturally eutrophic. But in the present times, most of the eutrophication which we are witnessing is caused by human activities, and the eutrophication caused by human activities is better called as cultural eutrophication. Eutrophication caused by human activities is better called as cultural eutrophication. Cultural over here refers to human induced. Cultural over here refers to human induced. However, if you come across the term eutrophication, it will be mostly in the sense of cultural eutrophication as well. So the newspapers, when they discuss about eutrophication taking place in any of the water-based ecosystems of ours, they may not specifically call it as cultural, but usually when they say eutrophication nowadays, it is referring to cultural eutrophication only. Because natural eutrophication may not be that much of an ecological challenge, it is the cultural one which poses grave danger to the ecological integrity of that ecosystem. So now when we have the cultural eutrophication taking place, which means that there is an artificial fertilization by the limiting nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus which has taken place into that water-based ecosystem. Let us look at next how this eutrophication, cultural eutrophication or eutrophication, which you now understand is nothing but a well-nourished water body. So how this eutrophication will have consequences for the ecological health. When the eutrophication happens and there is enrichment of nutrients, limiting nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus, the primary productivity of the ecosystem is going to increase. As the primary productivity increases, now what happens is that for the water-based ecosystems, one of a very important primary producer is going to be algae. So there is going to be overgrowth of algae. There is going to be proliferation of algae. And this overgrowth of algae or this proliferation of algae is commonly referred to as algal blooms. And this brings us to the first consequence of eutrophication for the ecosystem. With the enrichment of the nutrients, as the primary productivity increases, now there is going to be proliferation of the algae, fast growth of the algae, resulting into algal blooms. Some of these algal blooms may be toxic in nature. Not always they are toxic in nature, but whether they are toxic or they are non-toxic, they are going to have severe consequences for the health. But let me first discuss about the algal blooms, which can be toxic in nature. Examples of the algal blooms which are toxic in nature. If you have come across something called as red tide. Red tide is an example of an algal bloom. This is red in color, so that's why called as red tide. Red tide is a common example of algal blooms in the oceans. This is because of the overgrowth of algae called as dinoflagellates. So one type of algae which is found over there in the oceans, which gives a red tinge. So the entire ocean water looks red in color, and that's why we call it as a red tide. Though there can be other colored algae as well, like there could be a brown tide, there could be a yellow tide, again depending upon what type of algae has started to overgrow. And then we have something called as blue-green algae, which is not exactly algae. Sometimes there can be algal blooms which are toxic. Because of blue-green algae, which is, I'm saying not exactly algae, it is actually a cyanobacteria which is capable of photosynthesis. So, because of cyanobacteria again, there could be an algal bloom. All these algal blooms which I have listed out over here, the red tide, the blue-green algae which is growing because of cyanobacteria, the yellow tide and the brown tide, all of them will produce certain toxins. And now these toxins are going to contaminate the water quality, and upon ingestion by rest of the aquatic life, that aquatic life may die. So the biodiversity of the ecosystem is negatively affected because of toxins being produced by these algal blooms, and since toxins are produced by these algal blooms, we call them as the harmful algal blooms. They are called as the harmful algal blooms. So the harmful algal blooms are immediately going to cause damage to the ecosystem in form of death of the biodiversity, in form of death of the aquatic life, because in these harmful algal blooms, there are toxins which are released by this kind of algae. Different examples which I provided to you. Apart from the harmful algal bloom, this will have some other consequences for the health of the ecosystem as well. Apart from the toxins being produced, there can be other consequences as well for health of that aquatic ecosystem. Now what will happen is that if we have this algae overgrowing, this algae is going to cover so if we have atmosphere over here, we have the water body over here. So this algae, let's say it's a lake, this algae overgrowing over here will be at the surface. When it is at the surface, now this starts to inhibit the sunlight availability for rest of the ecosystem. And the entire photosynthesis of this ecosystem and the well-being of other organisms also depends upon the sunlight availability. So the problem for the organisms, problem for the aquatic life may also arise because of less sunlight being available. That is going to be another consequence of the algal blooms which are spreading fast. And now coming on to a very severe consequence of the algal blooms which are spreading fast. These algal blooms, as the algae is going to complete its life cycle, eventually the algae is going to die off. So algae, it has proliferated for quite some time because the nutrients were available. Eventually the algae is going to complete the life cycle, and when it completes the life cycle, it is going to die. Now when the algae dies, this implies that there is this dead organic matter which is available. There is this dead organic matter which is available in abundance in the water body. Now this dead organic matter being available in the abundance means that the decomposers will proliferate. Earlier the algae proliferated because the nutrients, it became a well-nourished water body through eutrophication. And now after completing the life cycle, as it dies off, there is a lot of dead organic matter which is available, which is going to be a food source for the bacteria, which is one of the major decomposers. So earlier the algae proliferated, and now because of abundant dead organic matter available, there is going to be bacteria which will proliferate. Bacteria will proliferate. As the bacteria proliferates, bacteria will require oxygen for its important body functions. Bacteria will require oxygen for its respiration, and bacteria requires oxygen for decomposition of the dead organic matter as well. So the bacteria, the aerobic bacteria over here in the water body, which will now function as the major decomposer, will be needing oxygen for two reasons, for two purposes. One for its own respiration, another for decomposition. And now this amount of oxygen which is demanded by the bacteria for respiration and for decomposition will be called as biological oxygen demand. I repeat, I said that the amount of oxygen which is demanded by the bacteria. And why will bacteria demand the oxygen? So bacteria is essentially going to demand the oxygen for two things. It will demand oxygen for respiration, it will demand oxygen for breakdown of the complex dead organic matter, which is essentially the process of decomposition. So now, the oxygen which is demanded by the bacteria for respiration and for decomposition, we are calling that oxygen as the biological oxygen demand. The biological oxygen demand. And as more and more bacteria is proliferating, you can pretty much predict the consequence. The consequence is going to be that the biological oxygen demand, which is commonly called as BOD of the water body, starts to increase. So the BOD of the water body has started to increase. This is the oxygen which is demanded, but the oxygen which is supplied will be called as the dissolved oxygen. The oxygen which is supplied will be called as the dissolved oxygen. Dissolved oxygen we represent as DO. So the oxygen which is supplied in real time in that aquatic ecosystem will be called as dissolved oxygen. It is this dissolved oxygen which will be used by most of the aquatic life for its own respiration. So as the bacteria starts to consume more and more of dissolved oxygen, now the dissolved oxygen starts to fall. Whereas the oxygen which is demanded by the bacteria for respiration and for decomposition, that's BOD, that starts to rise. Which brings us to a conclusion that now there is a supply-demand mismatch of oxygen in the water body. Supplied is what is denoted by DO and demand is what is measured by BOD. So there is a supply-demand mismatch of oxygen in the water body. As there is supply-demand mismatch, now the dissolved oxygen starts to fall. Consequence of that is that much of the bigger aquatic life, organisms like fishes are there, other aquatic life is there, that may not have adequate oxygen for its own respiration. As it does not get adequate oxygen for its own respiration, now what will happen is that the fishes etc. or the other aquatic life may start dying to death, may start suffocating to death, right? They may start dying because of suffocation to death. Now, as the aquatic life is dying, there is more dead organic matter available. And the bacteria is proliferating because of dead organic matter, because bacteria is essentially feeding upon the dead organic matter. So now as other aquatic organisms, they die, fishes etc. they die. Fishes etc. they die. Bacteria proliferates further. As bacteria proliferates further, what will happen? This bacteria will again demand more oxygen, will again consume the dissolved oxygen. So the DO further reduces and the BOD further increases. It becomes a kind of vicious cycle now which will go on into the ecosystem for quite some time. Eventually what happens is, if the DO becomes less than 8 milligram per liter, if the DO becomes less than 8 milligram per liter, so measured as milligram per liter, if the DO becomes less than 8 milligram per liter, it means that the problem for that ecosystem has started to take place. The water quality is now becoming less rich, or the water quality is getting degraded, is getting degenerated if the dissolved oxygen becomes less than 8 milligram per liter. But however, I said that it becomes a vicious cycle for quite some time. It becomes a kind of self-perpetuating process which is happening now. Fishes die, more of dead organic matter available, bacteria proliferating further, the demand-supply mismatch widening. So eventually it may happen that the DO reduces further, and if the DO becomes, let's say around 3 milligram per liter, we may call it as a hypoxic zone. Hypoxic refers to less oxygen. So we may call it as a hypoxic zone if the DO now turns out to be, let's say, in the range of 2 to 3 milligram per liter. And if the DO becomes 0, now we are going to call it as an anoxic zone. It is this anoxic zone which is now a dead zone. It cannot support any life because the DO turning out to be 0, becoming 0. It is a dead zone. So the aquatic ecosystem now has ceased to function as an ecosystem. Because ecosystem is supporting life, now this one does not support life. So this has ceased to function as an ecosystem. Simultaneously, the BOD has been increasing. So if BOD becomes more than 3 milligram per liter, it is again indicative of a degraded water quality. BOD more than 3 milligram per liter is again indicative of a degraded water quality. So this is going to be the consequence of eutrophication for that ecosystem. It could be oceans, taking place in oceans, it could be taking place in rivers, it could be taking place in wetlands as well. Wetlands for a very, very long time have been sites of waste disposal, sea waste disposal. There have been many regions when there are not adequate safeguards available for the conservation of wetlands. So they have been pretty much considered as wastelands. So there has been sea waste disposal, solid waste disposal into the wetlands. There has been agriculture runoff into the wetlands as well. So eutrophication is something which is a major or a grave concern for wetlands. So when I was discussing about BOD, we have something which is closely related, two terms which students often are confused with. One is the biological oxygen demand. Biological oxygen demand is something which will be needed by the bacteria for decomposition of dead organic matter. And closely related to BOD एक और चीज कहते हैं biochemical oxygen demand. तो students generally इसका difference they are interested in knowing कि biochemical oxygen demand, what is that? Biochemical will be needed is the amount of oxygen which is needed by the bacteria for decomposition of both organic and inorganic waste. For decomposition of both organic and inorganic waste. So the total amount of oxygen which is needed for decomposition of organic and inorganic waste, that is referred to as biochemical oxygen demand. And the amount of oxygen which is needed for decomposition of organic waste, that will be called as biological oxygen demand. A more wholesome measure, of course, is going to be the biochemical oxygen demand, because biochemical oxygen demand will look into the amount of organic waste into the water body, also the amount of inorganic waste into the water body. So a more wholesome measure, these both BOD and DO are used as indicators of measuring the water quality. So a more wholesome measure definitely is going to be BOD. But if we for sure know that the water body is mainly affected by the organic matter, then in those cases BOD can also be used. So now this brings us to the indicators which are used for measuring the water quality, dissolved oxygen. And I told you that dissolved oxygen, when it is less than 8 milligram per liter, it has started to indicate to us that the water quality is degenerating. If at all dissolved oxygen becomes around 2 to 3 milligram per liter, we call it as a hypoxic zone. And if at all things turned out to be pretty severe, that is the DO becoming 0, it is anoxic, it is a dead zone. It is anoxic, it is a dead zone. It has ceased to be an ecosystem. And when it comes to BOD greater than 3 milligram per liter, 3 milligram per liter is what is indicative of a poor water quality, unfit for drinking and a poor water quality. So the Central Pollution Control Board, or the state pollution control boards for that matter in our country, when they measure the water quality of our rivers, they look into a couple of indicators. BOD, DO are part of them. It also includes the total fecal coliform content, etc. But BOD and DO are the two major indicators which are used for measuring the water quality. And this is all about how eutrophication affects wetlands. Wetlands are very critical ecosystems. They provide lot of ecosystem services. Wetlands have lot of diversity, biological diversity to them. They provide critical ecosystem services. They're also called as kidneys of the planet because they can neutralize the contaminants, the microbes over there. Also other species like cattail and reed can neutralize the contaminant. So this kind of degeneration of the wetlands through eutrophication is a cause of concern. And world over, wetlands were facing pressures, and that was the reason why in 1971, an international agreement between the countries aimed at wise use of the wetlands, which means that we are essentially dependent upon the wetlands as they offer a number of ecosystem services, but there should be a sustainable and a judicious use of the ecosystem services. So under that Ramsar Convention only, since India is a party to the Ramsar Convention, under that Ramsar Convention only, now there are 75 wetland sites in our country, which are the Ramsar sites of our country, and the largest one being one of the biologically richest mangrove forests of the world, which are called as the Sundarbans. So that takes care of wetlands, that takes care of their eutrophication thing. Eutrophication is general across the ecosystems. And now let's discuss something else.